for another warm-up seminar or webinar of the European Congress of Medical Physics. I have to announce that you can send your abstract until the March 15th. Then you have 10 days to send your late abstract. And now we are starting what you are waiting for, a very interesting webinar about the tips that medical physicists can have when working in industry. And we have Jean Doherty, probably the convener of the early career special interest group, would like to introduce the speaker.
So thank you, Antonio.
Could you please introduce Jim, Leticia?
Yes. So thank you, Antonio, for giving us, as the special interest group, the chance of having our series of webinars. So for us, this is the first one inside these warm-up webinars for the Congress. And well, the thing is that I don't know if you can share my presentation, because I wanted to present that for the special interest group, we launched like a pool with all our members, and we asked them what did they expect from these webinars, which were the topics that they wanted to hear. And well, we just put some ideas on the things we thought were interesting for them. But of course, it was open, and it's still open for all the members of our special interest group, and they can send us their ideas by using our email. I can't see the screen. I don't know if you are sharing, for they can see the email address. Antonio? Well, okay, so if not, in the IFOM website, you can see the special interest group, and there you will have just our email address. And the idea is that you can always send us what you would like to hear inside this group of webinars, and we are open to your ideas. So I think that inside these webinars, we consider that it was very interesting to have this talk from this expert. And the idea is that there's life, or there is work besides the hospital, beside the, let's say, the clinical, and that we can look for other job offers, other kind of works, let's say, which are not only related to the clinic or the research. So you decided that this would be an interesting topic, and we hear this idea, and Brenda, our secretary, she gave us the idea of having here Jim, and we are very pleased to have him inside this webinar. I don't know if you can see now the screen, because it's some narrow for me.
Yeah, it looks broken as well.
Yeah, also. But here you have at least the email where you can send your ideas. And well, here you can more or less see which are the webinars, and which was the form that we sent to all our members. So I think that it's more or less everything from my side. So I will just go for the presentation of our speaker, who's Jim. So Jim O Doherty, he has a PhD in physics from the University of Limerick, Ireland, and he was trained as a medical physicist in the UK. So he then worked as a researcher at King's College in London on image-based research clinical trials, covering areas such as first-in-man radiotracer, radionuclide therapy agents, hypoxia, imaging, and cell line studies. He then became a principal physicist at Sidra Medicine in Qatar, overseeing a wide range of radiology and radiopharmacy. then moved to be a Chief Physicist at the Clinical Imaging Research Center at the National University of Singapore, being responsible for leading physics support over 50 imaging research trials, covering a range of imaging modalities. He then transitions into Siemens Healthineers in 2020, and he's currently working as a senior manager for the Clinical R&D Collaborations team covering half of the United States. He holds also an adjunct professorships at University College in Dublin, Ireland, and the Medical University of South Carolina. So I think he has a very broad curricula, and not only in imaging, but in all the fields, and he has the idea of the clinic, the research, and also the industry. So I think it's going to be a very fruitful conversation. Let's say first your talk, and then it's open for question and answers, and all of you can send us your questions at the end of the talk. He will be here for reply your questions. So thank you, Jim.
No worries. Thank you, Leticia, and thank you, Antonio, and thanks to the EFOMB work group for the invitation. Hopefully you can see my screen all right. So yeah, as she introduced, my name is Jim O Doherty, so I work for Siemens in the US. But previously I had, as Leticia mentioned, other jobs around the world that cover the areas of clinical support and also in research. So I thought it's probably best to start with some tips for a medical physicist if you're looking to transition between a clinic, industry, and academia. So what would you be in for in the next 45 minutes or so? Essentially a little on clinical medical physics, which most of you probably know because you are medical physicists, and a little on the industry of medical imaging, because this is the important one, is that I think a lot of us that work in a clinic lack a bit of business knowledge about medical imaging. Why medical physicists might be desirable for industry. This is a really important one because this kind of sells yourself to industry should you want to move to it. And then if we have some time towards the end, I can take you through some of the cutting edge research topics that I put together. Now, if you do a word cloud, which is a representation of words in different sizes and their frequency, if you look for medical physics across pretty much the internet, you get lots of words that are pretty obvious, like clinical, research, and imaging. But an important one there is that research is in quite a large font there, which means it's quite a popular term that shows up when you Google medical physics. So there'll be a little bit more on that later on because it's a key part in industry, because this is the sort of stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis. So should I work in imaging or medical physics in general? I'll try, my background is in imaging, but I'll try to make this a little bit more adaptable to people who also work in the radiotherapy field, but it's not my background, but hopefully it's transferable. These are just to show you that you do have increases in rates of imaging in the US and in Europe. Which is a good thing. It keeps us in jobs and it keeps us medical physicists busy. The more equipment that's there, the more stuff we have to do, and the more jobs that leads to in the long term. Now, one thing we probably don't know is how big these markets are. So if you look on the left here, you have the radiotherapy market, which has a compound annual growth rate. This is the CAGR figure of 5%. And if you look at the same value for imaging, it's 5.5%. So essentially these two figures show that there is growth in the imaging market. So they're predicted to grow by a rate of about 5% per year, which is good, right? So it's not stable, it's not flat, or it's not going down. So it means there's jobs for people in the long term, and these graphs are actually broken down by region as well. So you can see North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, Middle East, North Africa, Latin America. So they're all increasing, which is, overall good news for us. Does this translate to jobs into hospitals, and does it translate to jobs into industry? If you think of just a clinic, there's a need and a want. What do services require from a medical physicist? And I think for that, there really isn't a clear answer to that. It's something that depends on a lot of other factors. So where you work, where you live, with the type of equipment that you have, the accessibility of healthcare, education, roles and responsibilities, and rather than tell you all about it, there's lots and lots of papers that you can look through should you be interested in, what is the kind of current standard for how many medical physicists you have, what is the role of those medical physicists. That changes over time as well. And one thing I haven't covered in this particular slide is how they attach to clinical research trials and things like that. But essentially it's good news, because if you look at the figures of the OECD Health at a Glance, which is something I look at a lot, you can see the hardware numbers per country, And one thing I mentioned is that obviously medical physics jobs are country dependent. And if you look at all these countries and how much equipment they have, they vary a lot, right? So you have Japan on the left, which has lots and lots of MR, CT, and PET scanners, all the way down to places like Mexico and Colombia that have probably very high populations, but not quite the same equity in terms of its availability for medical imaging units. And of course, that's some way played out with the types of examinations and the amount of jobs, the amount of exams that are done in particular equipment. So if you look here, you have the United States on the left that has lots and lots of CT exams, MR exams, and PET exams. Having lots of equipment doesn't mean you do lots of scans on it. So you may have less equipment, but do more scans because the opening hours are different. But essentially, it's a very mixed bag, right? So it's kind of it's a moving target. Everybody has different levels of equipment, different number of scans. But essentially, it's growing at a rate of about 5%. So if you look at the makeup of medical physics, this was something that I kind of came up with. So the three pillars that you really have within our field would be academic, industry, and clinical. So they're the three kind of main targets, or you will always essentially work in one of these, or possibly a mix of both, or possibly a mix of all three. I kind of wanted to summarize a little bit. So this is an early careers webinar. So essentially, what would you need to be able to do this job? And I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but essentially there are some qualifications you need, and most of us probably know these, but if you want to be a really good academic, you need to be on tenure track or something like that. So you probably need a PhD. You may need to be an assistant professor, associate professor, all the way up to chief investigator, professor level. With the clinical sphere, it's a little bit more complex because you need a lot of job-related certifications. So that would be a type of residency program or some exams, like the American Board of Radiology here in the US, the Association of Clinical Scientists in the UK, the Irish College of Physicists and Medicine in Ireland, APSEM in Australia, or the European Exam Board within a kind of a general European scheme. You also may need some advanced certification, like an MPE, a medical physics expert qualification, to do certain jobs. In the UK, there's other terminology like waste experts, laser protection experts, MRSO, so safety officers for MR, radiation protection advisor. So there's lots of other advanced certifications you may need. But at a basic level, you definitely need some education, so a BSc or an MSc. And I've put in brackets the PhD and professorships and all that because they're helpful, but they're not necessarily required, right? So the advanced certification also isn't necessarily required, but it's something you may need to advance in those clinical jobs. Industry is probably the least strict of the whole lot because essentially all you need is a BSc. An MSc and a PhD is probably helpful, but again, industry is huge, so it depends on what you do. So advanced certification is probably needed by job, but typically in industry you may want something like a business or a marketing qualification like an MBA, so kind of more business related experience. And some scientific jobs may require a PhD. So for example, the team that I lead here is, we hire PhDs and postdocs. So, for some kind of high level positions, you may need a PhD as well. If you have a managerial job, that might need a managerial qualification. And, the list is endless because industry as a whole is very big and it really depends on what kind of stuff you do. So if you transfer from physics, medical physics in a clinic into industry, it really does depend on the type of company you have and the type of roles that you might fill. So from that respect, if we consider a direct transition only, so let's say we're interested in moving from one of these circles to the next and not really a mix of both. The easiest one is relatively straightforward. So if you're an academic, you can move into industry because you don't need all this clinical experience. It's fairly straightforward. There's not too much to it. Clinical into industry, also not too difficult because, like I said, industry, it's essentially a benchmark. It doesn't need the most qualifications. Like I said, it depends on the type of job that you might have within industry. Same into academics, although this may be a bit more tricky because moving from clinical into academic means that you need to be a good academic to begin with. It's not something you can just start at the bottom. As a postdoc, unless you're quite young, you're not going to start as a postdoc at the age of 50 or anything like that. It's doable, but again, you need to have a strong academic background before you can do it. Now, I'll put these two arrows in smaller kind of, bold, smaller arrows, essentially, thinner arrows, because these are the more difficult routes to travel. So if you're in industry or academia and you don't have a clinical background, it's very difficult to get into that clinical background. mainly because of the job experience that's required from a training scheme or a residency program or something like that. It's a lot more difficult to get that experience. So you have to kind of essentially give up your academic or industry background, move into the clinic for a set number of years and develop your training and your on-the-job skills, and eventually to develop your clinical qualifications. So that's by far the trickier one. So I think medical physicists who work in a clinic are probably in the strongest position in terms of moving elsewhere. Now, this is the type of a typical accounting job I got from a friend of mine not so long ago, maybe a few weeks ago. And I'm not going to read through it, but essentially you can see some typical duties there. And it's a relatively short list of about 10 to 12 typical duties that you would have to do for this accounting job. Right? So this is nothing to do with medical physics. It's a pretty good salary, but up to 78K a year. So this is a US-based job in Dallas. Now, just for comparison, and this isn't a great comparison, but it'll just kind of highlight to you, this is a job that I saw not so long ago. It's a typical imaging physicist job that was advertised in Ireland. You can see 10 entries here. They're a little bit more well described, but those 10 entries turned into 20 requirements, and that 20 turned into 27 requirements. Now, it's a fairly poor study of comparing one job advert to another job advert for two completely different jobs. But I think, to me, this kind of explained that there's 27 requirements for this particular job. So it really demonstrates the broad scope required of a medical physicist in institutes. And at the very bottom, you can see number 27. After all those things that you may have to do, it also says other duties that may be assigned, right? So this is a very, very broad job, which can be really good as well, builds good experience. Now, if you want to know what the skills of a medical physicist are, you don't even Google anymore, just ask ChatGPT. I won't really read these things out to you, but essentially it's things that we probably already know. So advanced knowledge of medical physics, clinical expertise, research skills, proficiency with any type of new technology, whether that be Linux or MR Linux or PET Linux or whatever's around these days. Being able to solve problems, collaboration with other healthcare professionals, leadership and management, eventually when you kind of move along the tracks to lead teams and things like that. And CPD, which is learning and development. So without going too much into details, these are things we probably know that aren't really all that new to us. My own summary essentially would be a little bit less verbose. It would be things like people that would have an interest in physical sciences, an interest in medicine and patient care, good attention to detail, especially when it comes to tasks that are not so exciting like quality control and things like that. Concentration, self-motivation, an inquiring mind, problem-solving skills, good observation skills, and underlining all that, you should be pretty good at maths and technical skills and things like that. So what do we have to offer? I think, at least in my own experience, you kind of don't know until you start looking around that we do actually have very desirable skills to other employers. It's just a case of finding those employers. Now, I put together a bit of a list here. Who are the main employers? And this, by the way, is not an exhaustive list. There's loads more. So you have hospitals, whether they be public or private, universities, research organizations, which would be things like charities or metrology labs like NIST in the US or CNRS in France or PTV in Germany. Any type of charity, so Macmillan or Cancer Research UK or any of those big charities that require expertise from medical physicists. Number 4 would be medical instrumentation manufacturers. And I separated these are still medical devices, but I separated these from traditional medical device manufacturers purely because most of us in medical physics tend to end up working in industry for one of these big players like Siemens or Canon, Elekta, Varian, any of these huge companies. Software companies, so things like image post-processing, image reconstruction, treatment planning, any of these things that involve more software writing rather than instrumentation. And sometimes they're both, right? So Siemens, Philips, Canon, they all make software and hardware. The government one is a less well-worn route, things like regulators for radiation safety. You can work in a health department, you can be an environment inspector or an auditor, a grant review body such as Science Foundation Ireland or the NIH here in the US or the NIHR in the UK. Number 7 would be things like pharmaceutical companies, probably more relevant for people who follow closely nuclear medicine tracks like Mallinckrodt, Boston Scientific. And the types of jobs you get in there would be QA or regulatory affairs or R&D. And one of those examples would be knowing what type of imaging technique to apply for a drug development study. That would be one particular aspect for it. And number 8 then lastly would be traditional medical device manufacturers like Medtronic and Draeger and Stryker and a host of others. They would make things like surgical equipment, ventilators, catheters, stents, any of that kind of stuff. So they would cover the non-traditional medical physics stuff, but still routes for employment for there as well. Now, my own background, if I tried to map my kind of experiences onto this list that was back here, and essentially I worked at one of quite a few of these. So I had a year abroad at NIST in the US when I was younger. As an undergrad student, I did my medical physics residency in the UK, the Royal Surrey. I worked at King's College, which is an academic university hospital. I then worked at a hospital. I then worked at another research centre, and then now I work for industry. So essentially my own journey mapped pretty well onto this. So it was one of these 8 at any given time, or sometimes a mix of both. So in the US, you have a lot of hospital jobs that would always involve a university faculty appointment as well. And the same, I think, in the UK in some places. So an example of what might be available, I did a really quick search this morning. I think I might have done this yesterday, actually. So if you Google medical physicist in London and then make sure that you're selecting industry roles only, I found 57 hits in a search that took me a few seconds. Now, the one important point is that I think the role for hybrid and remote working is starting to, it's still very strong. And for 32 of 57 of these jobs, there was still hybrid and remote options, which means I searched in London, but it doesn't mean you actually have to be in London. It means you can be in the UK, for example. And obviously you can repeat this search wherever you live, and you might find other options wherever you live that may have a remote option, which means you don't need to move house, which has been quite stressful over the last few years, even for me. Now, this one is a little bit more unusual. So this is an example of how industry values good scientists. So the task here is to guess the job. Now, I usually do this interactive, but obviously this is a webinar, so I'll try kind of fill you in a little bit. I'll only read the parts that are in the red boxes. So what this job is looking for is programming skills, analytical problem solving skills, understanding of statistical modeling, research publications, things like that. Here's another one. Knowledge of predictive modeling, able to extract data, experience in designing, developing a scalable machine learning, artificial intelligence, experience with machine learning platforms such as Keras, PyTorch, and TensorFlow. Now, to me, this sounds like a postdoc, but when you kind of look up what job it is, it's actually for a senior quantitative financial analyst at the Bank of America. So it shows that, you know, even outside the traditional routes of working for a device manufacturer or a pharmaceutical company, there's still some stuff out there that medical physicists could be quite good at, right? So something like this, when you read the job skills, if you're working as a postdoc or a PhD student in the field of artificial intelligence, this may be absolutely perfect for you because, you know, it's financial analyst, salary's probably pretty good, conditions might be a bit tough, but, you know, it just shows that there's non-traditional routes out there as well. So the more traditional routes, I just put together a bit of a list. These would be the more typical international employers. So we're talking more about companies that have a footprint in many different countries. So here would be a handful of a few I could find. I'm sure there's many, many others. There's no reason to think that this would be an exhaustive list, but these were the ones that came to my mind fairly quickly. So if you want to look for the top 10 medical device companies in the world, you can just ask ChatGPT or you can Google it. So you have the typical ones like Abbott, Medtronic, Siemens, J&J, Fresenius, BD, GE Healthcare, Stryker, Philips. So these are the ones that kind of dominate the market in terms of hospitals and the type of equipment that would be in such hospitals. And a very quick look would give you availability for medical physicists or R&D related jobs here. So 61 for Fresenius, 173 for J&J, and I think I only found a few for BD, so it was 28. And even within Siemens this morning, I found 263 open AI jobs. So it'll show you, and some of these were a data science tech lead, some were engineering related. If you look at the last one, there's IT, audits, digitalization, all these kind of, I wouldn't say random jobs, but jobs that have not traditionally been around. So it'll just show you that there's still quite a lot out there, even at this particular time. I suppose a quick side note then on software AI, there's a lot of employment in imaging software. And these days, if you say imaging software, there's no way you can avoid it being machine learning or AI related. If you look at the hype cycle for artificial intelligence, so this gives you a graph on the y-axis of the expectations and the x-axis of time. So essentially any new technology will start off slow, it will have massive expectations, and after a while you get this point called the trough of disillusionment, which means actually it's not as great as it might have seemed. It needs some tweaking, needs to be rejigged a bit and advanced a bit more, and then you get this kind of tail later in time, which is called the slope of enlightenment. They've all got these kind of weird cryptic names, but essentially every AI technology will be on this curve at some point. So it may be really, really cool, and it's kind of got huge expectations, but then after a while it may not actually be as good as it seems. Now the point of telling you this is because if you look through FDA approved artificial intelligence related softwares in medicine, what you find is that the FDA have approved an absolutely massive amount of AI related software in the last few years for healthcare use. And I'm probably aware that if maybe this text is a bit small, but the vast majority of these are in radiology. And I can give you a few examples. So there's so many of them at the moment. So there's a few here like Viz.ai, which detects stroke on CT scans, Arteries, which is I think one of the first approved back in 2016. And that spots cancerous lesions in liver and lungs on CT and MR. There's other ones like AI Doc, which is growing and is very, very popular these days. And that looks for brain bleeds and head CTs, pulmonary embolisms, things like that. So in a little bit more detail, the 692 devices on the FDA's updated list, and I think up to 2016 maybe, there were only a few, right? So this has all been mainly in the last few years. And 78% of those are in radiology. So this is quite a massive, massive jump from where it used to be even just a few years ago. And I think at the rate it's grown, it's very much an exponential rate. So you can see up to here, this is back as far as 2022. I don't have any figures for 2023 yet, but essentially they expect this to kind of keep continuing for the time being as more and more AI and machine learning stuff gets more popular. The main contributors for this, if you want to look into a little bit more breakdown in terms of who would do this sort of work, you have the bigger slices of this pie chart would be GE, Siemens, any of the big kind of medical manufacturers, Philips Healthcare, and also a few smaller ones. So AI Doc is 2.5% of all these submissions, Canon 3.3%, HeartFlow, if you know what they do, 1%. So they would take things like a coronary CT angiogram and do some AI training in terms of coronary blood perfusion volume and cardiac flow and things like that. So there's quite a few of these players that have a small slice, but a non-significant slice, because it's very difficult to get an FDA clearance for an algorithm, and that allows you to sell it within the United States. Now, this is also a massive area, because if you look at any news articles, you'll see that a lot of academic employment is kind of rife for this stuff. So there's new centers opening everywhere. Here in the US, you have UC San Francisco. They're launching a new center to advance artificial intelligence medical imaging. There's the London Medical Imaging and AI Center, which is in, I forget exactly where that is, but it's quite a nice center. There's Duke University here in the US, which is also launching another center for artificial intelligence. Imperial College, this is a slightly old slightly old news article, so the 10 million center in medical imaging and AI at Imperial. So there's loads of stuff being built around the place in terms of growing this academic popularity for it. And in terms of collaborative research, something I do a lot of in Siemens. So a lot of these companies would work with institutes to develop specific research projects of mutual interest to both the company and also to the academic background as well. And there may be funding opportunities or a joint application to a funding institute based at a national or a government level. And these would normally traditionally involve medical physicists, because they're good at finding problems to solve, and especially having the freedom to pursue these different solutions. And companies are very good at taking some of these solutions and turning them into products, and sometimes even partnering with the university to build a center. So for example, there's the Dyson Centre for Engineering and Design at Cambridge, there's the AstraZeneca and University of Oxford, which developed the vaccine for COVID some time back. There's the University of Tennessee and Siemens that built a research facility, and there's UTH South with the historic campus with a $30 million security project. So there's lots of these kind of collaborative efforts between companies and universities to build new research centers. And if you look at, you know, the kind of more, if you look on the left side, so you have three separate parts where you have a university, a government, and industry that are kind of completely independent and separate. But what you would more want is a situation on the right-hand side where you have a better link for collaborative research between a government, a university, and an industry. So that would be something like joint research possibilities for funding, for example, or strategic demands from government that they could ask from the university, who would then tax industry to kind of get the money to be able to do those things. And industry then collaborate with universities, like I mentioned, on new project ideas, innovations, new research projects, having academic staff based at the company or based at the university, or vice versa. The whole thing is just a bit more joined up. And most countries would be somewhere in the middle, right? So they would have a good link between university and government in terms of funding, and maybe a good link between industry and university and industry and government. It depends on the country, right? So this collaborative research aspect is more developed in certain places than others. A small word on salary. So this, you know, you can kind of paint a really nice picture in terms of what it's like to be a medical physicist in industry, but the main thing is, okay, well, what's the salary like? What's the health of the wages, essentially? In the UK, where I worked, you can find it really clearly online, right? So you Google the band that you're going to get paid in the National Health Service. It's very clear what you're going to get paid. In the US, it's very different because healthcare is primarily privatized. The range of salary that you can get can be very, very high. And on this graph, it can go up to around $300,000. And it tends to be higher in industry, right? So that's kind of a general point all around. And again, that depends on where you live. So in North America, for example, it's quite large. In the UK, it's not so different, right? So again, this depends on where you live, but chances are if you work for industry, you'll get paid a little to a lot higher than you do doing your current clinical job. So general tips, join mail bases. There's a lot of ways to find out information about courses and jobs, and you know, there's an example of one for the medical physics and engineering in the UK. There's one in the AAPM in the US here as well. Join LinkedIn, ResearchGate, follow companies you're interested in, try attend conferences and workshops, talk to the people on the booth stands at conferences. I typically tended to walk past them back in the day, but you never know, that some of them could be hiring or looking for a good physicist. Keep an open mind, consider moving. You could relocate. I've done that quite a lot. It gives you a broader scope on your resume. Many opportunities might be flexible. In industry, at least, there isn't always a fixed person. So we're not looking for, let's say, a particular level or grade of medical physicist. We'd be just looking for somebody, and depending on that somebody, the job can be tailored. So it's a little bit flexible, especially, like I said earlier, in terms of qualification. So you're likely employable in other areas as well. Like I said, this financial analyst job that showed up earlier because of your strong analytical nature of medical physics and the fact that you know numbers, which I've heard a lot before. And like I said, formal education, having a medical physics residency or being a radiation protection advisor or all this extra stuff, it usually isn't required in industry. So the background part of your education can be a lot more flexible. There really isn't the same requirement. Now, very briefly, I'll try not to spend too much time on this, but I did want to kind of run through briefly some of the types of things you could work on in industry. So I'll probably try to get this done in 10-15 minutes. First one would be biology guided radiotherapy. So there's a nice company out there called Reflection. And if people have heard or know the principles of an MR LINAC, this one is quite similar in that it's a PET LINAC that's supposed to help with such problems like this, where you have EBRT, external beam radiotherapy motion. There's a little video here I'm going to let play for a few seconds, but essentially what this system does is it joins together a PET scanner and a LINAC. And what you have are these lines of response from your PET signal, and essentially these lines of response that make your coincidence window, essentially, you would shoot an X-ray down those lines of response. Now, it's only just been approved by the FDA last year, and they've just carried out the first therapy in the US as of the end of last year. And it's quite futuristic. It's very cool. It's not quite at the level of doing exactly what I said. It's not quite shooting single X-ray beams down lines of response, but it's pretty close to it. And I'd urge anyone, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, it's definitely the future. It's quite a futuristic thing to have, and it's a very, very nice system. Like I said, the first world's first cancer patient treated with this technology called Syntix. That was done in August last year, and it's kind of only just getting bigger since then. There's a few specifics to it, and there's a really nice research paper as well if anyone's interested. It's quite a nice overview in terms of how all this stuff works. Another one, radionuclide therapy. Again, this would be specific to people who have a background in nuclear medicine. I won't go too much into it because it's quite niche, but essentially there's lots of companies that develop products that, you know, for therapy agents or even for diagnostic imaging agents as well. And then that in its own right leads to more things like radiotherapy or radionuclide dosimetry through imaging and all those different position papers that people have advocated that they should be a bit larger, and how these therapies have grown over time as well. I'll skip that because it's just essentially saying that there's oncology treatments and non-oncology treatments, showing the range of different agents that are used in the clinic. Now, this one is one that we use a lot in Siemens. This is a photon counting CT, which was FDA cleared in 2021. And the difference is that instead of having a scintillator as an indirect X-ray converter, where you have an X-ray that strikes a scintillator, produces light, and then that light is detected by photodiodes. It's a two-step process, giving you an energy-weighted accumulated signal. Our latest technology is a photon counting detector. So this essentially has an X-ray that strikes a cadmium telluride semiconductor. That's converted directly to an electronic charge. So it's a single-step conversion where the impact produces a charge that's proportional to the X-ray energy. And that allows you to measure the energy information associated with that X-ray beam. It gives you four clear advantages. So it gives you better contrast in the images. It allows us to do things like higher spatial resolution at the same dose. It gives us spectral information in every scan because we can control the energy windowing. And essentially, because it's all electronic, you can remove electronic noise, which ideally leads to lower doses in the scan. Here's a few examples. So we have our middle column here is EID CT. So this is our energy integrating detector CT. And the right column is the photon counting detector CT. So this image here is of the stapes, this tiny, tiny bone in your ear that has a thickness of about 0.4 millimeters and a length of 1.2 millimeters. So you can clearly see the stapes there. It's that kind of triangular shaped bone beside the yellow arrow, showing that it can be quite well resolved at super high resolution. And you have a cochlear implant as well, a cochlea there that you can see the difference between at the bottom, the EID CT and the photon counting detector. It shows you better contrast in the image and better resolution. Another one would be things like high field MR. So if you don't know much about MR, most clinical magnets would be 1.5 or 3T. You know, higher field strength gives you higher signal and higher spatial resolution, but comes with a lot of technical issues in terms of maintaining the homogeneity of the magnetic field. You can get 7T systems. There's only about 100 installations worldwide from our particular Siemens product. You can get a 7T and a 10T and 11.7 as research systems only investigating neurology. And I've put a selection of papers there about how people are currently developing 14T and 20T research systems. And there's a few of these being developed out there in the US, China, and particularly in Germany. That one is probably the more advanced than all the rest of them. There's other things like helium-free MR. So if you work anywhere, you've probably seen these tanks if you work in MR where you have your helium. These are 3 pictures I took in 3 different countries that look, you know, they could be anywhere. There's one from the UK, Qatar, and Singapore. You still have to have helium in your MR scanner, with about pushing 2,000 liters depending on the scanner. And it has to be topped up every few months. So there are newer technologies that aim to use other methods of cooling. So for example, Siemens have a scanner now where it uses 0.7 liters of helium. It's completely closed, it doesn't need to be topped up, and it doesn't have a quench pipe where you have these massive accidents like this, where your helium comes out the roof of the building. So essentially having it all contained within the one system with this technology called dry cool, and then it's a 0.5T system, so that can be trained on images to make them look like they came from better scanners using an algorithm called deep resolve. So people may have been aware of that already, but essentially it's an AI-powered algorithm that allows you to have low field MR with high signal to noise based on the fact that it can be trained to improve those images. Digital PET's another one, and there's lots of players out there. There's Canon, United, GE, ourselves, Siemens, and Philips. Philips actually had the first one quite some time back. So what this is it replaces those photomultiplier tubes that are inside the PET scanner with either an avalanche photodiode or a silicon photomultiplier. And what this does is it gives you essentially better signal to noise and potential for time of flight imaging as well. Now, this is something that I can see where a lot of old PET-CTs will be replaced with newer digital systems within the next few years. I don't think everything is going to become a digital PET. I think there's always going to be a market for the older PMT types because they're much cheaper, at least for now. And they've kind of transitioned away from doing these basic investigative studies on how good they are to regular clinical routine use of studies in larger multi-center trials. This is another comparison study. So a lot of the work, the early work, at least maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, was still doing comparative work from these digital systems against non-digital systems, but that's starting to change now as well. Now, lastly, large field of view PET imaging. There's only 2 players at the moment, United Imaging and Siemens, and some of these images are absolutely amazing. So this allows you to do whole body dynamic PET essentially, but it also allows you to do regular FDG scans at a fraction of the time. So you have other blockades in terms of being able to inject patients quick enough to put them on the scanner. But I think anyone who is in the field of nuclear medicine can probably appreciate that these images are pretty amazing. This is very new. So United had the first one some time back, and Siemens followed up a few years later. So there's some basic work still being performed, like comparison studies I said earlier. So comparing these long field of view systems against non-long field of view systems. Things like EARL compliance, so the European Reference Lab standard of how you do PET essentially. Comparison of clinical cases. The NEMA standard doesn't really account for the gains due to the huge increase in sensitivity of these systems. There's a few papers there if people are interested in terms of the kind of more basic references of how these systems can be used. And some of this research shows that a 2-minute long axial field of view system gives you the same signal to noise as a 16-minute short axis field of view system. So comparatively, you can save 14 minutes on doing a scan. And the bottom right image shows you there a scan that was performed of, I think this patient was a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, with a 14 megabecquerel scan between 12 minutes, 10 minutes, and 8 minutes. And I think, not being a radiologist, you can appreciate that the images look fairly similar. But essentially, it shows that you can use less time or less activity with these really long systems because the sensitivity is so high. Here's another image of lung adenocarcinoma. So this was a patient who had 51 megabecquerels imaged it dynamically from a minute up to 20 minutes. And, I'm no radiologist, but I guess a radiologist would pick their desired length of time to scan that patient and possibly shorten their imaging acquisition protocol. Now, lastly, just a small note on reliable AI, because it's really hard to avoid. It really is everywhere these days. There's lots of parts of AI that can be employed in the imaging chain. So things like motion correction, reconstruction, patient setup, making landmarks, automatic segmentation, post-processing analysis, all these different things that can be done. And, it's very, very difficult to keep a handle on exactly where in these products some of the AI stuff may even be, because it's literally in most situations, it's in most of it. And there's a need for these solutions as well. So if you take a look at the pre-Brexit workforce census in the UK, you can see the increase in CT and MR scans, and it doesn't really follow the increase in terms of whole-time equivalent consultants to actually report these scans. And one thing I found recently was that there's even chatbots that can help you with, can help our radiology colleagues figure out what type of scan to give a patient. So there's this one called Rad Appropriate in ChatGPT. And what you can do is you can input a patient's clinical history and the clinical question. So you can give them the exact reasons why the patient came to the hospital. And what the question is, do you suspect that there's an infection? And this particular chatbot has gone and learned all of the appropriate clinical guidelines. So ACR, chest imaging, thoracic imaging, has learned all these guidelines, and it can spit out what it would suggest the type of scan that you can give your patient. So whether you should give them an MR or a CT or a chest X-ray, or whether you need to send them to the cath lab, it can tell you what type of contrast to use, what dose of contrast to use, what MR sequence you should use, what kind of dynamic imaging you should use. So it's quite advanced. It's not FDA cleared, of course, because this is on ChatGPT, but it just shows you the type of stuff that people are doing with this in terms of being able to save their time. And last note, then, you can get entirely new journals based on AI. So if anyone's interested, I'm sure you've probably seen some of these new offerings already, or you can get special AI issues of current journals. So this is one from JTI, the Journal of Thoracic Imaging. And if you look a PubMed search using artificial intelligence in the title or abstract, no one is surprised to see that it's been an exponential increase as well. And I don't really see that changing anytime soon. Now, this doesn't mean that they're all fantastic quality. It just means that they're already available. And that happened mainly when the computational power really increased in around 2017, when the classification error for the ImageNet large-scale visual recognition challenge declined. So it got to the point where the computation is just so good that a lot of things can be realized, but it's hard to weed out the good stuff from the bad. Last slide. Healthcare is a huge interest from non-traditional healthcare companies. So I've got some slightly older articles. So you have companies like Microsoft making a huge entry into healthcare, and even appointing a medical officer, right? So this was back in 2019. So you see companies like this that traditionally have not had a background in healthcare appointing a medical officer and spending all this money on AI technology. And now Facebook is doing this sort of stuff as well, so or Meta, whatever it is now. But essentially it shows that there's lots and lots of people spying healthcare as a good market to make some money. So final slide, takeaway points would be to tell you that medical physicists are an attractive hire for industry. You might not think it, and especially with companies that you might not traditionally have thought of as well. And companies would tend to hire from academic pools, and I think they may overlook medical physicists. So, it's nice that you make yourself known to them should you wish to do that. You can also do things like consulting for industry without fully moving into it. I've done some of that over the years, and some of you may have as well. Same way you can lecture at a university without being a full-time academic. A kind of a crossover is possible without a full move. If you do move internationally, it needs a bit of extra planning. So, for example, changing your CV around because you may have a lot of terminology specific to your qualifications in your country that may not be known elsewhere, for example. And hopefully the flavor of topics I showed you demonstrates the type of ongoing R&D work you could be doing. I made that mine specific to my background within Siemens, but obviously that's a very narrow slice of the field as a whole. And AI at all points along the imaging chain is, at least for us, and I presume every other healthcare company, it's undergone massive expansion. So it's by far the one that's going to be leading the pack over the next few years. And with that, have any questions, please go ahead, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jim. Impressive presentation, and we are really grateful to you to share with us all your huge experience in 5 countries, in the industry, in the academia, in the hospital. I think it's very important for this group to have people like you. Sorry, we have some questions from the audience. And we are lucky because Irene, the Secretary of European Matters Committee, is also here. Irene, can you read the question or not?
Yes, sure. So the first question, thank you very much for the interesting, great presentation. Thanks a lot. So the first question is, some physicists are afraid to move into the industry. They feel maybe they can lose contact with the patients and or clinical staff, and they will be more like engineers, only focus on the machines. What should you say about this?
I see the concern, and I think I had the same concern myself. So it is a different job. You're not responsible to patients when you work for a company. You're responsible to the company. That's, for me working in Siemens, that we sell scanners, right? We sell stuff. That has to become the kind of primary goal. And it's important not to see industry as the enemy, but there is a change in focus for sure. You're not as involved in direct primary care, but in a roundabout way, we'd like to think that R&D helps in clinical care eventually. I would say in R&D it's a bit more long term. We try to think that we are doing things to help patients because we build new systems, we build more efficient programs for radiologists to help them read better, for example. It just isn't quite on the ground doing treatments or doing the really basic stuff like dose assessments and things, but it is different. I totally get that point.
Great, thanks a lot. The other question is that you've showed a search in medical physicists into job offer sites. What if they ask about skills? I'm not sure to have not only related to science, programming and so on, for example, but soft skills like leading projects and so on.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that should definitely be, elucidated on your CV or your resume. A lot of them would have these kind of soft skill things, like so management being a typical one. Have you supervised people before? And for any physicist who had trainee physicists, the answer is probably yes. It may not mean that you're responsible for a team of 50 people, but it does mean that you have some experience. And I think that's something that should be expanded on if you saw this type of soft skill in a job description and you thought, okay, I'm going to apply for this job, then you should tailor your CV in such a way that that's very clear that you have some of those soft skills. And one thing I think is always missing is that medical physicists, at least ones who deal directly with patients, that's a skill that a lot of companies would value a lot because not many people have those, right? There's not many people that speak directly to patients. Even in my industry, it's not really something that we have to do. That's down to radiologists or physicians, cardiologists, or medical physicists. And I think that's something that could be definitely expanded on in a CV as well. That's a soft skill that I think people overlook.
Okay, great, thanks. Another interesting question. What's the role of medical physicist expert to manage, audit, control the AI?
That's a really good question. I think I read a paper on this recently. So essentially, if you're going to install an AI solution in your hospital, even if it's one of our solutions, it's down to the local team to verify that that system is supposed to do what it's going to do in your hospital. So us as manufacturers, we can make an AI program and say, look, this is what we say it does. This is our academic evidence to prove it, because we will collaborate with people before we release that program. We have to if we want to get FDA clearance for it. The FDA, obviously, in the US or a CE mark in Europe, a little bit different, but essentially they will prove, or they will say, okay, this thing does what it says it does. But before that gets installed in a hospital, a medical physicist would probably be the best person to figure out that this system actually does what it's supposed to do, and it's not giving, for your particular use within the hospital, it's not giving you complete rubbish, essentially. But usually manufacturers will work with physicists to kind of help them, or whether it's physicists or CT techs or whoever is going to use this tool to help them, demonstrate that it does what it's supposed to do.
Great, thanks. And the last question, actually, it says job for medical physics, for medical physicists in industry seems to be very focused, related on AI and programming. Should it be a place for clinical applications like implementing protocols?
Yes. And so the main reason I focus on AI is because I think that, and I personally think a lot of the stuff in the next few years will be AI. Everything will be AI related, whether it's post-processing or whether it's part of the reconstruction. It doesn't mean that other things like clinical applications and developing new protocols aren't there. They very much are. And we hire a lot of people who are former medical physicists to become clinical application specialists, or other types of roles we have, such as customer success managers. So they're people that do something similar in terms of being able to help people get the best out of their technology. It doesn't mean that AI replaces everything. I just think it's very important, and it doesn't necessarily mean that all the other stuff doesn't exist, because clinical application support is very important, and it's something that we have a lot of staff doing here for any vendor, for any manufacturer.
Thanks a lot. And they were also asking something about links for Europe, if you have any links in Europe.
In terms of what kind of links?
Yeah, it was just links in Europe. Maybe the person that asked the question maybe can write. The last one is that if you have links such as those from AAPM for Europe.
Okay. I'm not sure what particular ones for AAPM. Was it for like the mail base or like finding out more information about medical
Can the
physics jobs?
person that did the question give us some more information?
Yeah, if it's related to things like the mail base, so personally I found the one in the UK because I worked in the UK for a long time. They advertise a lot of jobs there, and a lot of people from around the world advertise there. You don't have to just be from the UK. I think you just need to be involved in the medical physics field. And I think, Irene, you were actually involved in this as well at one point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a good resource, and there's other resources like that. If there's others around Europe, I may not be aware of them, but I know EFOM has a good jobs career page as well, where they allow industry to post on that, not just academics and not just hospitals. I don't know if that answers the question without more context.
Great, thank you so much. No more questions from the audience.
You're welcome. Anytime.
Antonio,
And
you
if anyone wants to contact me at any time, please do. I mean, I don't know if it's helpful, but I can offer some advice or some tips and things like that.
Very nice from you, Jim. Well, I think that I have a few things to say after you. Only say you thank you for this interesting speech. Remember, we can see in Munich in the CMP, and then you can incorporate, you can become member to the early career special interest group if you have any interest, and probably Leticia has some words to say about or to Jim. Thanks, Jim. See you.
Yeah, no worries. See you at ECMP.
So thank you, Jim. Thank you, Antonio and Irene. I think it was a very successful talk because you more or less pointed out all the things from research, from industry, and from the clinic. And well, you say that we have to go for the industry because we earn more money. So I think we can let our PR to the industry. No, seriously, I think that as medical physicists, sometimes we are a bit scared of moving into industry. We don't see the path, or we think it's difficult or hard. So I think this helps to demystify this path. So yeah, thank you very much. And for me, I think it's all, because with all the questions, I think you broaden your talk. So yes, thank all of you. Thank to all the people that was in the webinar, and we invite you to send more input for the next series of webinars to be useful as a warm-up for the ECMP Congress. So thank you.
Hey, bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me. Speak soon.
See you.